She graduated from Universidad Central de Venezuela in Caracas. And she's currently an adjunct professor at FIU. She's teaching formative 3, which is design 7. She's also an adjunct at FAU, Florida Atlantic University in Fort Lauderdale. Fabiana founded Lugar, Común Arquitectura, which is an office that she had back in Venezuela since 2010. With that office, she designed several projects, I guess mostly residential, but Casa de la Abuela, which is the sort of grandmother's house, if we translate it into English, is a project that gave them great recognition, and it was invited, or it was accepted, or participated in the 11th Biennial of Architecture in Venezuela, and also was part of the Biennial, which is a very prestigious biennale that includes all architects from Latin America, Spain, and Portugal. And I always quote, I always point out that it's very difficult to be part of that Biennial and to be just accepted is a recognition, because when we say Spain and Portugal, we're saying Rafael Moneo, Alvaro Siza, people of that sort of stature. So it's very beautiful to be sort of admitted into that event. She also participated in the Glen Market International Masterclass, which happened in Australia, right? And she had a degree in advanced architectural design from the CCA in San Francisco, which is the California College of Arts. Fabiana also has interest in sort of multidisciplinary projects, exploring landscapes, sprawling urban conditions, and sort of the intersection between infrastructure and architectural design. To me, it's a great pleasure to have Fabiana here, because I know her since she was a student an undergrad back in Caracas, and it's great to have her as a colleague in FIU. And as much as I know the house, I've seen the house ready, I don't know the process, and so I'm really excited to see how it's coming. So I mean, everybody's mute, but if I just want to remind everybody to please mute your microphones. And you have, I allowed you to share screen, so.
Okay. Well, thank you, Henry. It's also an honor for me to be here and be able to share the house with your class and with you. Also because I think that this, like you said, you brought a very broad, you brought different people from different contexts to show their work. So I think this helps the students kind of understand a little bit more about what we architects do, and mostly on the site in different environments. So I think, can you see my screen now? The screen? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so La Casa de la Abuela, as Henry said, translates to grandmother's house. So this is the project we're seeing today. Alejandro Aravena, in his acceptance of the Pritzker Prize speech, said that what we architects model is not bricks or stones or steel or wood, but life itself. Architecture is about giving form to the places where people live. It is not more complicated than that, but also not simpler than that. And life ranges from very basic needs to very deep desires, from ordinary activities to extraordinary events, from the self to the collective. Webster defines a house as a building that serves as living quarters for one or a few families, home. We can conclude that architecture, as well as the domestic space, are the reflection of the necessities of any society in a given place and time. Studying these realities helps reveal situations that we sometimes ignore because we consider them routine, when in fact they have an origin and a purpose. We can confirm that there are certain lessons you can extract from the observation of certain buildings and the city or landscape where they are inserted. In the case of the house, the diversity of configurations that have been generated so far and the ones to come are infinite. We have explored from the primitive hub of Loyer to the Palladian villas, the Usonian houses of Wright, and the Machine à Habiter of Corbusier. They are all valuable lessons of architecture. When faced with the difficulties of conceptualizing a house, architects propose through design strategies different solutions to address a common denominator, which is solving the program according to the user's habits and way of living. This is something very particular on a house. It is very personal, and it requires a special understanding of the dynamics of the family, their friends, and even the rest of the community where they are inserted. For architects, the concept of house, home, and habitat are inevitably interconnected. They merge to cover a vast territory in which you can fit many different scales, solutions, and circumstances. For non-architect population, the idea of the house has always been linked to a series of spaces, activities, and services, bedrooms, bathroom, kitchen, etc. Or even a predetermined image, more or less traditional, consisting of an enclosed volume with roof, windows, walls, and doors. Depending on its cultural period, the house has a form, a materiality, a size, in the collective memory, and every non-architect recognizes without much thought what a house is and therefore what it isn't. In the architectural sphere, on the other hand, the house is not only an inhabitable building with a recognizable form, but it is also, in a real sense, and not only metaphorically, a safe place suited for life. This brings me to Webster's second definition of house. A shelter or refuge, such as a nest or den of a wild animal. Natural covering, such as a test or shell that encloses and protects an animal or a colony of sorts. A building in which something is sheltered or stored. That sensation of shelter and safety is a fundamental component on the collective idea of a house. But there are dualities of play that are present at all times. The house cannot be conceived as an enclosed fortress absorbed in itself. Its nature is to generate a relationship between the interior and exterior, to link the public space with the private and the individual activities with the collective. As we see here in some of these examples, like the glass house from Philip Johnson, or the Rufo house from Alberto Campo Baeza. A house understood from a broad architectural view, without giving much importance to form, dimension, and location, has to be flexible and simultaneously set limits and integrate itself with its environment. This is a very complex task that we have in our hands, and when we talk about the idea of a house, the duality between the shelter and the openness is always present. Venezuela has always been gifted in everything related to climate and geography. Its architecture seeks to solve that relationship between the interior and exterior, the public and the private, and the collective and individual in a very genuine way that is responsive to these favorable conditions. We can see in this house, Casa for Jimmy Alcock, of the relationship that we have been talking about with the exterior, how it becomes very rich in this geographical environment because of the amount of green and the relationship with the exterior is made possible by the favorable conditions and the favorable weather that we have in the region. You can see that as well in Casa Sotavento from Carlos Raúl Villanueva. This is a house also in a coastal environment similar to the one that we're going to see today in the project, where the house opens itself to the exterior. La Casa de la Abuela is located in Puerto La Cruz, Anzoátegui, on the east coast of the Venezuelan front to the Caribbean Sea. It is very important for the house to develop these relationships and honor the geographical scale and the tropical climate. So as you can see over here with this dot is that city where the house is located, and this is more or less what the environment looks like. This is the Caribbean Sea, and all of this is kind of like in man-made infilled canals. A little bit like what happens maybe in the closest thing here is Bolordo. So all of this territory was created to expand the capacities to build near the water. So the house is located in a neighborhood very similar to that one, specifically this one, which is a system of canals that communicate to a greater canal and eventually the Caribbean Sea. The house was commissioned by my grandmother, who is originally from this region, so she understood well the conditions of the area. She grew up in a traditional colonial house with gable tile roofs and patio, so this influenced the kind of house she envisioned to have. Colonial architecture is part of the heritage that the Spanish culture left behind after colonization. This term has, for most people, including some architects, connotations that are very precise and oftentimes mistaken. It evokes for some a pastoral realm with simple white houses and red tile roofs, round columns, and the occasional ornamental decoration. I think this was what my grandmother imagined when she thought about her childhood house. And I think this architecture has very little to do with ornament and a lot to do with space. The configuration of colonial houses has always had a specific organizational pattern. Buildings that are placed around patios and corridors that act as protections from the elements, but at the same time are the connectors of spaces. We see here some examples of colonial architecture, patio, and the corridors in this case. The relationship between the interior and exterior is achieved through spaces of intermediation, which generate a new place where the elements used for climate control and privacy are resolved as spatial filters. We have here some typical sketches from Carlos Raúl Villanueva for this spatial filters. Again, the corridor, we have this louver system, patio. It is essential to understand the essence of this architecture in which the outside and the inside meet, integrating and working as shelter. This is, again, Carlos Raúl Villanueva with the Casa Sotavento, where we can see these relationships happen between the exterior and exterior. So we see some of these components, even from the analysis that he does from colonial architecture, translated later into one of his houses. We also have Casa La Ribereña in Caracas from architect Jimmy Alcock, which celebrates also in a more contemporary way the relationships of the outside and the inside through this corridor that takes you to the entrance of the house. And this house from the architect Fruto Vivas, Casa El Café, also celebrates the relationship through the use of the louver system to allow for the light to come in a more gradual way, again, towards the entrance of the house. We can see how these values have been part of the exploration and study of many of the Venezuelan architects and how they have achieved to produce spaces with these qualities. After analyzing the colonial houses in Venezuela, we identified 5 types of traditional spaces that are constant and crucial in the composition of the space. These are the patio, the corridor, the zaguán or hallway, the window, and the porch. Each one of them is simultaneously a space, a form, and a place. To design a house using the colonial architectural elements, we initially experimented with placing the predetermined form of a perfect square on the site, which did not adapt or recognize the particularities of the lot and the place. So this is the lot, and when we place the typical form of the square to generate that patio, then it did not have some relationships with the existing lot and the site. We decided to open that square towards the water, and then immediately we began to manipulate the essential form to adjust it to the circumstantial conditions of the site. We arranged one of the sides of the square tangential to the curve of the lot, which allowed us to gain more area in order to meet the requirements of space that the client demanded. So this one over here shifted to adapt to this condition, and that allowed for this volume to be much larger. As part of the request, we needed to solve the program on one story to facilitate movement throughout the house, since my grandmother knew she would not be able to climb stairs on her own as time went by. This defined from the beginning the separation of the program in two very clear volumes, one for social and one for intimate areas, as we see them here. This would be the social volume, and this is the one for the intimate areas. The two were linked together through a unifying roof that housed them all. The development of the roof arose from repeating the strategy of the indigenous Shabono, which, with a single section that is extruded around a circle, forms in a single operation the entire building. So this is the Shabono, and as you can see, the building is basically formed by the entire roof, which is one single form, and it behaves as a single structure, wall and roof at the same time. In this case, we apply that principle to a regular section, allowing the roof to act as an element that articulates the entire house, while the structure and walls adapt more freely, responding to particular aesthetic, functional, and local conditions. So you can see here the resemblance of that condition of the Shabono of having a unifying roof. The Shabono is the collective housing of the Yanomami Aboriginal in the Venezuelan Amazon. It is composed by a ring that creates an inhabitable space. To the outside of the ring, it acts like a barrier from the vegetation and the wildlife. Towards the interior, it is an open and communal space that is covered and protected from the elements. Its continuous and unitary roof forms a corridor where the daily tasks take place. In the central courtyard, the Shabono finds its true spatial and spiritual meaning. It is here that the house connects to the environment, looking into the sky and projecting into the exterior world. Thinking of this symbolic connection with the outside in place, we made the traditional center of the colonial patio into the pool, reminding us of the presence of water as an agent that morphed the place in which the house is located, and reflecting the sky and the house itself onto the exterior. So we located the pool in the center where the patio was, and the pool was given by the resulting shape of the footprint of the house. So this presented at the beginning the challenge of how we would be able to build the pool on site. The thing is, in Venezuela, because we have seismic conditions, we have earthquakes, it was suggested that we poured the floor plate on a single solid slab, so we can give it some what we call a floating condition. And so in the case of an earthquake, we wouldn't have active breakage points on the slab. But the pool could not be poured at the same time as the structural slab for the entire house. So actually it is very special that the pool acted as a symbolic element to interpret water as a morphing element of the place, but it was also a morphing element from the beginning in our construction site. The pool itself was casted from the beginning. It was the first piece that was casted and poured on the site. So here you see the site when it was empty, and the pool was the, let's say, the originator piece for the entire house to be built. This was mainly due to the fact that the slab had to have some joints in between them and the pool for it to act structurally and not break in the case of the earthquake. Here you can see some of the slab already being integrated into the site, and the pool was already finished. Some of the images then for all of the work that goes on to build the slab is then placed around the pool as a resulting system. Here is very interesting because you can see all of that work being done in place as the process went by. So all of the rebar that you have to set in place before you pour the concrete for it to be possible afterwards to kind of tie along the columns and the structural system to the existing slab is what you see over here. And then, since I mentioned that the slab needed to be poured on a single operation, or let's say on a single day, because of its condition of being a solid slab, we had to resort to bringing a full truck of concrete. It wasn't possible to just mix a piece, pour it, and then continue pouring in phases. So this was a full day's work. We had a lot of personnel on site, and we were pouring the slab at the same time that there were people already kind of leveling it out. It was a very interesting process to see because of the conditions of the area. It is very warm and very hot, a little bit like in Florida. The slab needed to be constantly watered so it wouldn't dry and crack before the concrete could set itself. And then eventually, after that process was done, we could see how those columns begin to take form on top of the slab. Some of the columns, and I will explain later why this is, have a more specific detail, and some of them look, let's say, a little bit more smooth. They don't have this detail. We will explain that in a little bit. And this is how it would look from the roof. And going back to the Shabono had that circle from the top, which emerged from that resulting form of the void or of the common space. And here is the same. The void is given by the resulting space of the patio, which in this case is taken by the pool. So when you see the pool back in the image that we saw here, kind of reflecting the space that the roof leaves behind after kind of hugging the entire house. This is part of the process to put together the roof as that resulting space. And some images. Okay. After defining all of these elements, the resulting scheme allowed us to comply with the areas required for the program and solve it entirely on one story. The house opens towards the canal to allow for the views. And so this is over here the lot, and we are on an interior canal, which only allowed us some views towards some hills that we have on the back of the city, and then eventually towards the neighborhoods that are around and other canals. So we realized after making this study that the most favorable views, which are the ones on this lighter color, towards these hills over here and towards where the canal opens, was the area that we wanted to set for the social spaces. So the area for social activities is placed parallel to the street To gain length and give these social spaces the best vistas and project eventually this porch towards the garden and the canals. So you can see here how that area is the one that is directly pointing in the analysis towards those hills. The porch is the place where my grandmother, in her daily activities, hosts friends. So this area of the house for her was very important, since this is an activity that she does daily. This is her actual porch in her house in Caracas. So we wanted to recreate this condition and this atmosphere in the house. And this is one image that we have from activities being taking place in the porch of the house today. So the porch was located in the place of the lot with the best visual record of the daily activities of the waterways and the views. All the social spaces enjoy the location that can participate to a greater degree in that particular life of the canals, marked by the motion of the boats that come and go throughout the day. It is very interesting to sit here throughout the day because you see all of the activity that goes on in the community. So it was very important for us to establish that connection from the beginning. The bedrooms are located in a continuous volume to the east, parallel to the boundary, and having less possibilities for interesting views of the surroundings, they live towards small side patios that act as landscapes of an intimate scale. Different from the other areas in the house, they are designed for rest and isolation. So initially we intended to have the bedrooms towards some patios, and originally these were conceived more open. We knew from the beginning that the rooms were going to face a boundary wall. So we didn't like that condition so much of having bedrooms that, although we wanted to give them privacy, would have to face a wall. So from the beginning, we conceived the idea of having small patios that were more intimate for each room. As we went by with the construction, we faced reality and the situation of insecurity in the area. So the client pointed out that after we build the boundary wall, which has a certain height but is not completely or super tall, it would be like a small wall, we would still have the complications of people kind of entering through the wall into the bedrooms, and that situation being very insecure. So that's when the idea of the pergola came in. In a way, the pergola acts as a climate regulator or a light regulator element, but at the same time, it secured the space from the top, and it allowed those bedrooms to have a different quality within those patios. So when you see here during the development of that facade, we were thinking a lot about the rhythm of the windows and the relationship with the exterior, but that ultimate decision of having the pergola is kind of the consequence of analyzing the realities of the site. And for us, it was one of those good surprises, which eventually I want to point out that all of the things that we had to modify because of security circumstances of the area or because of the local particularities were actually to the benefit of the house. Nothing that was eventually imposed on us because of the realities of Venezuela, and specifically the realities of this town, was ever a problem in the moment that we had to face with these changes during the design process in the construction. So eventually this rendered for a better result in order to have these patios with a much better condition and the pergola, and it allowed for the client to have the security in this facade that he was intending to have. And this is part of the process of the building of that facade, that right now you can perceive it because you don't have the boundary wall, but it's curious that after that, that is a facade of the house that you really don't perceive at all. And it's something that you live from the bedroom in a more intimate scale. On the other hand, the corridor serves as a connector, allowing movement in between the bedrooms. and it is the space of intermediation in between them and the central patio. So this corridor on the other facade for the volume of the bedrooms had also a very particular situation in terms of security. So the canals are to the front or to the south of the site, and then the security problems there were that this corridor was completely open. We always wanted to recreate that colonial corridor and establish that relationship with the outside. We always imagined people coming out of their bedrooms and just jumping into the pool. So it was very hard for us when the client came back and said that the corridor needed to be closed because anyone could just come on a boat from the canals and enter, again, the most intimate or private areas of the house which were the bedrooms. So that was a security problem that we had not thought when we designed the house. At first, when we thought of closing the corridor, it was like, okay, we lost the space. A corridor that is enclosed is not really a corridor. It's just going to be circulation space, and it's not going to have the spatial qualities that we were trying to recreate from the colonial architecture. But then again, this constraints became an opportunity to rethink the space and redesign it, and this is when we thought of including a low bench. And it seems like a very simple operation, but the low bench allowed us to establish this enclosed relationship of the corridor thought of as the same qualities of the space that could live towards the outside areas. And eventually you could allow the corridor to still have relationships with the outside, but at the same time, it would allow us to rethink the possibility of having some sort of elements that would close in between one column and the other. This area was always thought as a space that would live towards the pool and could be also used to sleep in hammocks. So therefore, we wanted to extend the intimate activity of the bedrooms to that intermediate area and for people to gather and socialize in a different way on this space. So because we wanted to keep the nature of the corridor intact, we eventually decided that the best way to address the problem of how to enclose from one column to the other was to go back to Biennial's element with the louver system to allow that porosity and that continuous view with the space and to allow the light to come in and preserve the conditions and the spirit of the space. So this is very close, or a very close image of how this looks today. So you can see the bedrooms still have a relationship with that corridor. And when you have it open, it's almost like the space is still continuous with the outside. And you could still sit on the bench and towards the other side have that relationship with the pool. So it's of the space today on the corridor facing the other direction. And this is the view from that interior patio into the corridor. So this was the final result of, like I said, having to go to rethink the conditions of that colonial corridor that was intended at the beginning to be open during the site because of the existing conditions. For us, I think it was a plus, and it's much favorable conditions now with the possibility of closing it and having a different light atmosphere in here, as you can see in this picture. The San Juan, or entryway, directly associated with the street level through a series of stairs, is defined by the highest point of the ridge of the roof. The two slopes facing the street are double curvature surfaces, which generates a tension towards the corner where the entrance is located and also produces a notable effect of movement when approaching the house from the street. This is this point over here, and as you remember, the San Juan, which is the entryway or hallway of the house, was marked by the fact that the roof elevated itself there. We initially intended to have that high point on the roof, not only to mark the entrance of the house, but it was our opportunity to explore with a more contemporary language within the traditional form of the tiled roof. But this presented a lot of challenges and a lot of study of geometries. There were a series of studies that we had to do first in the office through 3D rendering and 3D programming to allow for us to understand that condition of the double curvature, while the canal preserved the 2 points in the canal for the roof preserved the same point in the z-axis or on their height. It was constantly changing on the highest ridge of the roof, and therefore it was a challenge constructively, and it was also a defining point because it forced us to ask ourselves, well, how much is too much? At what point the roof will not allow us to go up anymore? And how is the space going to absorb this difference in height? So these are some of the images of the roof after it was poured, and you can see very slightly the surface and the double curvature and the effect that generates towards the street when you approach it. It's kind of like if the roof was moved mostly from the other facade. You can read it, yes, you can read it better from this facade. I also want to point out here, because you can see some of the images of the exterior, that facing the materials for this entry point of the house was also something that we had to address with local materials. The conditions on the site being a little bit like Florida, humid and warm, the client wanted to avoid as much paint on the exterior of the house as possible, because it's a lot of maintenance, and every 5 years you need to repaint. The area, fortunately, has a lot of stone cover. We explored a lot with some of the local stones. The one that is most prominent is a reddish kind of yellow stone in the area. At the beginning we wanted to use that one, but then we stayed away from it because the roof is already red. So we eventually ended up using this material that gives this finish to some of the exteriors of the house. On the interior of the San Juan, this space articulates the intimate and the social spheres of the house, and is also a place to receive guests on a less formal occasion. So this is that interior space that I'm talking about, and this is that hallway that we call the San Juan. We wanted to achieve those light qualities because it has the maximum height of the house, as we showed on the exterior, and then we took advantage of that being the linking point in between the two volumes of the house to allow as much light to come in different directions. You can see that hallway here. We repeated the operation with the bench towards the exterior to define the spaces and to allow or give an opportunity of the space to gain life and to have its own activity within the house. And these are some views of that interior, which is the highest point of the house. And you can perceive, we have a person here, a little bit of the scale that high point of the roof, how that kind of translates into the interior space, and how that allows for this opportunity of the capturing of the light through the windows and eventually through the roof to happen in one single space. Usually when you see the Colonial Salon, it's a very dark space that takes you from one area of the house to the other, but in this case, it's a very illuminated result. It is important to point out that the time of production of this house has been immersed in economic, political, and social crisis. This crisis has affected the professional practice of architects, not only in the conception of new projects, but in the scarcity of materials for construction and personnel, amongst other challenges. The material and construction procedures with which we had to work were therefore somehow dictated on us. This did not completely prevent the material and construction processes from being closely linked to the architectural ideas, since fortunately, reinforced concrete is incredibly versatile. We originally designed the roof in wood because we wanted to refer to the colonial tradition and the inheritance of the constructive past of the Venezuelan coast. But instead, we had to use concrete. So here we see our original sketches when the roof was intended in wood, and some of the images when we thought that this was the constructive method that we were going to use. We ended up using concrete, as I said. This readily available, rough and strong material, monumental but simple at the same time, required us to reconcile its nature with the architectural intentions that arose from the design strategy. So because we originally intended for it to be wood and then had to switch materials, we needed to adjust a lot during construction time to achieve the same quality of space and all of the intentions that we had from the beginning. The use of reinforced concrete made possible the materialization of the concepts that we had intended for the design, and at the same time, honoring the emblematic material and showing its tectonic qualities. You can see in some of these spaces how you see the detail in the material that we use to cast the concrete, and the richness of the space that is kind of allowed or still configured by the use of this material. So for us, it was also, like I said, when I was talking about the corridor and the circumstances that we had with the security issues, it was a happy surprise to switch materials, even though we intended at the beginning to have a lot of wood details and things designed and translated or given to a carpenter to design a lot of the details and give richness to the quality of space. The simplicity of the concrete eventually resolved the space in a much simpler way, and it allowed for maybe light and space itself to really be protagonistic, which I think it was a much better result at the end. The second challenge we faced as a result of the crisis is more related to the means and methods of construction of the house. There are local means of transportation and manufacturing, some materials that are available instead of others, a labor force with certain qualifications, and budgetary limitations that constantly force us as architects to rethink what Louis Kahn called the how. We should not assume a position where everything must stick to the will of what is desired and imagined. We needed to stay flexible, and we needed to remain true to our design intentions and ideals while considering the aspects of the local reality. Otherwise, we would undermine the possibilities of the creation of the house, which is ultimately a necessity and the goal for the client and convenient for us as professionals. Also, we needed to stay flexible because even though there must be a relationship between materiality and the expression of the architectural ideas, it is also true that there is no single way and no one material to express an idea of architecture. I think this is very important. As you can see, when I was talking before about the quality of the space, being fixed to what you design in the office and having those ideas manifest in universal reality is something that sometimes distances you from the possibilities that opening your mind and receiving new feedback from the opportunities that are given to you from the site. And like we said, the local constraints eventually result in a much better resolution than what happened to us in Casa de la Abuela. So here you see some of the interior images, again, of that roof, casted and poured in concrete, and how the structure, the naked structure, like you see in these images, already speaks of the space and the qualities inside the house. Here we have a page that shows that. The structure of the house was originally thought of as a common portico structure of beams and columns. But the early calculations suggested that the beams could disappear and the roof made of a solid slab that rested directly on the columns. The difficulty we faced then was how to resolve the gap at the top between the two sloping roof surfaces, which allows light to enter the internal spaces. So this gap over here that we constantly see in the roof is what we're talking about. We did not find it convenient to support the upper roof plane extending the columns because they would appear interrupting the span with variable sections and rhythms along the roof. We then proposed a solution by producing elements that we call structural parasols, which in addition to fulfilling the supporting functions of linking both roof surfaces, served to allow the entry of direct light into the interior, as the windows were usually protected under the porch and wide corridors, and therefore light was not able to reach some of the most interior spaces of the house. So here we see some images of that gap, and eventually these are the structural parasols that we designed to go in that space and resolve that joint. We proposed a solution by producing, the structural parasols are made up of prefabricated pieces on site, and together they work as a truss that runs through the entire ceiling, articulating the two canopies. As you can see here, we proceeded to pour the elements directly on the first slope of the canopy. We initially thought that we would be able to cast them kind of on the ground on the side and then put each one individually there, but because we had to solve the differences of the heights of the top slope that was constantly changing in that Z-axis, we assumed this condition of the parasols behaving as an uninterrupted beam. So this is when we casted them on top of the first slope and then assigned that Z-axis that you can see a little bit over here, and then we see the highest point over here in this image, and then proceeded to cast in place the parasols. And in the interior, you kind of see that beam condition that they have and how they rest on the columns directly without having that component or the beam component on the rest of the roof. The design of the structural parasols evolved with the evolution of the house on site. So they changed many times to accommodate the realities of the construction. That is some of the images on how the parasol developed and how we changed them on site many times. At the beginning, the window was the one absorbing the difference in heights, but then we realized that would be very expensive to produce custom windows throughout the entire roof. So we decided to just have a smaller gap, kind of with a prefabricated window, to allow for light to come in and let the concrete absorb the differences in height between the slopes. And I believe this is how you see the light come in the interior. So it wasn't a significant change, and it allowed for the client to have a great reduction on the price of the production of those windows, but we would still get the light inside the space with the qualities that we were looking for. This is the parasol once it's finished. We decided to take some of the elements or the synthetic wood that we use for the pier to place it on the parasols. Like we said at the beginning, because we intended the roof to be wood, we thought of having a lot of details and elements of wood designed by carpenters for the roof. But again, having the sun all the time hitting these areas of the house would have been a maintenance problem. So we decided to use the same synthetic material, which eventually look very nice and gave this very nice rhythm to the parasols. The area of the bedrooms over here, and going back to us talking about that structural system where you see the rhythm of the columns on the inside of the house. So the area of the bedrooms has a regular and repetitive modulation for the columns that conforms a bay of approximately 9 by 13. And although it's a small bay, it was defined by the dimensions of the space and given by the use of the columns of a side of 8 inches, which is not common. Normally the minimum side for a column is a 12-inch. But we decided to change them and just make them into longer columns so that they would have a visual continuity with the masonry walls of the rest of the house. So as you can see, that operation allowed us to have smooth surfaces along the interior of the spaces, not only in the bedrooms, but in the rest of the house. And so on the social areas, although there is a continuity and rhythm, like in the bedrooms, the structural organization is less regular because we needed to adapt to the variable forms of the space. But you can also see how the columns respond to the same logic, and they end up giving the appearance of load-bearing walls, a little bit like Wright-Usonian houses on the interior. So the columns were only elements that were visual on the corridor, on the bedrooms, and on the porch, because the columns were the ones defining, or the elements defining these spaces. And that was ultimately very important as well, because it was part of maintaining that language from the colonial on the areas or the spaces that really require that language to construct the space or to build the space itself. But the interior of the house absorbed some of that. And the intention was, like I said, to have smooth spaces where we were not having beams interrupting the space. And so we wanted the columns to stay as well embedded within the space. I'm going to show very quickly or walk you through the spaces, but I'm going to play a video that can show you a little promenade on the house, so you can feel a lot of how these interiors are lived, and how the structure is very present within the house, but at the same time is kind of responding to this constructive language with the masonry walls. Okay, let me go ahead and stop the share. Henry, I'm going to go ahead and play the video.
All right, perfect.
Okay. Now we're on the limit with time.
All right. Yes. Perfect timing. Yeah. 10:30. Well, thank you very much. That's great. Yeah. Very nice to see the process and refresh the images of the finished house and the drawings. Some of the drawings I have seen before, but some are new. So I just want to open up this session for questions. We have 40 students or 40 people connected. We don't know how many are students, but I guess most everybody is in a class.
Can we just ask?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, you can post it on the chat. I can read, or you can just go ahead and ask.
First, thank you so much. So many precedents, like overloaded with precedents, and I just love that I got to see so many different types of houses, like from all over the world. So I really, really appreciate that. I just wanted to ask, I don't know if I missed it or not, the types of materials that you used for the house, because I know that you said you'd started off with wood, but that had to change. So you went to concrete, used a lot of concrete, and then you were talking about that you used some of the material that was used on the sidewalk, but I'm not sure like what that material is called, or if you still ended up using wood for those, for the shading devices. And then I saw you had some stones in there. So I was wondering what all of the materials were used.
Yes, so thank you, Maria. I really appreciate your comments, and I really appreciate that you enjoyed all of the precedents. So yes, the materials were chosen. I mean, there were two factors. One, the weather there is really tough, it's intense. The sun is out all day and it's very intense. So the materials needed to be very durable. So again, at the beginning, we envisioned a lot of wood being used on the exteriors because we wanted to recreate some of the atmospheres of the homes that we showed. But then again, realistically, for maintenance purposes, and because it's also next to a canal and the water, so humidity wasn't going to be excellent for the wood, and then finding the wood in Venezuela was a different scenario, or finding a wood that, you know, has the qualities to sustain that amount of humidity. So wood was out of the question from the beginning, but we had a lot of details, and then they came alive, or we gave them richness with the concrete. The concrete is a very plastic material. You can do and morph it into any shape. And lucky for us, concrete is like the material by excellence that the labor in Venezuela is used to building with. So we translated a lot of the details. Even if you saw on some of the planters and everything, they have a lot of details in concrete. So it was mostly concrete. And then the decision with the stone, you know, to define some of the walls and the outside of the house, and to define some of those areas, like to make some differences between what is the intimate and what is that entry space. Like I mentioned, there are a lot of quarries in the area with a lot of stone. So we visit some of those they had, and I don't know if you saw some of the houses in the context, they feel very yellow, red. They have a lot of these red stone in the area, and initially we really liked it, but then we had the problem of having too much red. The tile was red, and also the red absorbs the light differently, and we wanted the materials, the interiors to read very light. So we stayed very light colored in the interiors, and then allowed for that gray stone eventually that we found to define those volumes on the outside. Some materials, I have to confess, were a last minute decision of the client, like the material used on the floor on the inside. We had always had stone because it feels cold. So it was nice, but then, you know, materials became very complicated, and mostly like finishing materials became very complicated to find. This is what he found at a good price, and we said, okay, let's do it. It's good. It wasn't our first choice, but it still, you know, addresses or allows for the values that we want to maintain in the interior to exist. So some things are just circumstances, but you make the best of them.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
There is a question here posted on the chat. Which phase of the process was most challenging for you as a young architect? Conceptual design or construction? And what was your most valuable resource to overcome those challenges?
Well, before doing this house, I had only worked at an office with another architect for a year and a half. So everything was a challenge. That being said, I was lucky enough for that architect to give me a lot of responsibilities from the moment I entered his practice. So I had dealt with some construction side problems, and you know, I worked for a year and a half in this house when I was in this practice, where I gained a lot of experience on how to handle myself with the other professionals on the discipline. So I had a lot of contact with the engineers. I knew how to put together all of the documentation that they needed. This house is 4 hours away from Caracas, so traveling a lot was always problematic, because I needed to understand during the process of construction. It wasn't like I want to send a drawing and they'll understand. No, I needed to go there and practically teach or give classes to the people that were working on site, because they had never done anything as complex as this before. So it was challenging for everyone. And honestly, yes, it was very challenging. Not much in terms of design, but on how to, it was my first time doing something related to the colonial. That's why there was so much care and process of studying the traditional values of the colonial architecture and understanding how to translate those values into a contemporary language, because I wasn't going to recreate the typical colonial home. That wasn't what I wanted to do, and I certainly did not know how to do that. So that was challenging in terms of design. And then the construction, it was mostly having to you know, to travel so much, to teach the people that were working there what the vision was and how to make the changes, because a drawing wasn't doing that. The drawing wasn't coming across. It wasn't serving as a document that communicates the ideas, because, you know, the personnel, like I said, was used to building things that were very simple.
Okay, we have other questions here.
Yeah, sorry.
Darren, go ahead. You're mute.
Thank you for sharing that presentation. It's really kind of a beautiful house. I did notice the tremendous amount of detailing in this project, from, you know, the base of the circular column to like some of the reveals and the planters and the use of wood, the wooden baseboards. I mean, so many little details. Was that a process? How did you go about that process? Was it all generated from your vision of the project, or was there some client input to that amount of detailing? How did that all come about, and how did you get that level of detail if you're saying that the construction team was used to more simple projects?
So yes, that's a mixture of funny stories. When maybe being a young architect, you know, you come fresh out of the school, and then you're not so, I don't know, intoxicated by the realities yet of you know, the discipline. And so you want to do everything. So I have to say that at the beginning, we over designed the house. There was so many details, and it's wood and detail here and detail there. And then we're like, okay, we have a budget, we're in this reality, and now we're doing concrete. So it was mostly a process on translating, on not going from the very detailed and fine craft of the wood to like a rough look on concrete. We wanted the concrete to express the same amount of care that we put when we thought that the house could have some detailed elements. So we took the time to kind of explore the possibilities on how to give the concrete some qualities and some graciousness. And then we realized that maybe the way that the columns would land on the floor, so therefore you see that on those details, like I mentioned before to Maria, the planters had a detail in concrete. So everything needed to be kind of translated into concrete, and that gave us the opportunity to explore how you detail with that material. Then on site, since the personnel was not skilled to do this, like I said, there was a lot of moments where I had to go there and literally take the wood that we were using to cast the things and build a one-to-one, like a one-to-scale, you know, situation where I showed them the detail and, okay, this is what you're going to do times 10 or times whatever. And we were fortunate enough to work with one of the kind of the head construction manager was a retired dentist. So he was a lot into details and casting. And so he was the one that kind of understood that we needed this thing to really show every single detail on the concrete. And it couldn't be just like a brute result. He was very exacting. So it was good to have him.
Yeah, I can jump in to expand on that to Darren and everyone. You know, you kind of build up that relationship with the contractors and the workers, and I'm pretty sure it was the case with Fabiana and Gianni building this house, that there is a moment where you sort of your connection to the job site is so strong that they cannot do anything without asking you at some point. Like, so we're waiting for you to tell us how to do this. And it becomes a very sort of beautiful kind of connection. It's exhausting because then it's like we're waiting and you know, I used to live in Caracas and work in another city. So commuting was painful because of the conditions, but, and you were like, no, don't wait, just do it like, you know, what we just did. So there is a lot of like that you built up in the process that is actually, it's really beautiful. And you know, it's always a learning process both ways, because, you know, they ask you, you kind of explain things, but then you understand how they see it. And then you learn also from them, like, you know, how it gets built. Because ultimately when you submit the drawings for like a structural contractor, the way he sees the drawings is completely upside down, like unfolded, because they have to build the negative of what you're asking for. So
no, I only asked because I've built a house here in Miami myself, and you know, everything is built with concrete here, and it was really difficult to get that kind of detailing, you know, just in the formwork.
But mainly because of the attitude. Like back here, I mean, as Fabiana was saying, they're more open. And
that's
like,
nice.
like you say, why don't we change the formwork here? Why don't we extend it a little bit? And they will be excited to do something different. Where here, they will see the opportunity to charge more.
Right.
You will say like, I'm not gonna let them like rip me off. Like, okay, let's just do it like that.
It's more like a team effort, and really wanting to help the architect achieve that vision, I guess.
No, I have to add regarding that, they felt proud. They felt they were building the Guggenheim. They would talk about their house because you saw the houses in the context, you know. So they felt like they were, you know, building the next big building of the area. So for them, it was also important to come to work and make this look perfect. Yeah. I mean, it was very beautiful to see that on them, that they really felt like, oh, they would talk in town. Yeah, I'm the one building this house, and everyone knew about the house. It was very nice.
Okay. That's nice to hear. There are still people that take pride in their work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, there is one question, and I will have to sort of end the meeting because we have to go somewhere else. Can you talk about the decision-making process with regards to the client? Like how set the decisions, were the decisions at the beginning, or how fluid were the decisions during the construction? How did you deal with change?
Oh, this is from Juan. Well, Juan, I have to say, the client, super stubborn. So it was hard. Nothing was said from the beginning. We had a set of drawings of this is the house. And then, like I said, we came to reality and everything needed to be changed. The thing that I mentioned with the security, like, so now we're closing everything. So, you know, you panic. You don't want the values of your architecture to change. So you end up working more because you're like, no, wait, if we're changing things, let me draw it, let me test it. So it was a lot of going back into the drawing board. And like, even after the project was finished, we drew a lot of supplemental things and we explored with new renders to make possible these changes and to really test first if they were going to be okay. And then some were just directly tested on site. We had to take decisions right there. So they were very fluid. Like this thing that happened with the floor, one day it was like, this is what we have and this is what we're using. There is no negotiation. And we were like, okay, let me see if we can at least cut it in a certain way to generate a module that corresponds to the dimensions that we have. You know, that's as much as you can decide at that point. So it was hard because I was young to deal with those constant changes. Like, you know, like I said, you're very in love with your project and you don't understand that reality will change everything. Right now, I feel differently. I feel like all of these things were opportunities. But we dealt with it. Like it was a good opportunity. Change was always good. So we dealt with it. Okay.
Yeah, kind of like to also close that, also to expand on that, the idea that the set of drawings has a permit and they're used to build does not have the same weight as construction documents have here as a legal document. So in that sense, it's more open. I mean, the architects have to be ready to sort of embrace a lot of suggestions and changes, I guess. And it's more like in the DNA of the architect that is trained to work in that context as different than here.
Yeah.
Okay, well, it's 10:47. I think it was great, Fabiana, again, to have you here with us and see the process of the house. There is always the
yes, Fabiana, thank you.
Super nice. Thank you, Jason.
I've been listening. I'm working, but I'm listening. Very nice. Beautiful house.
Thank you.
Thanks for the presentation.
Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, thank you.
Somebody asking for contact? So
yeah, Darren, yes, of course, you can always contact Fabiana and contact her directly. She's in the FIU directory, or I can send you her contact information. Yes, what was I going to say? There's always the beauty of the construction process, right? Like you said, you get so used to that atmosphere that I could almost smell the sort of the humid concrete and the wood and the dust and all of that. And I really miss all of that. But it was just beautiful to see. Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for participating, and see you soon.
Bye.